Welcome to the Form Essentials series. We are going to learn how to nail forms in your Livewire apps. The browser end, the server end, validation. We're going to cover a bunch of different input fields, conditional inputs, all sorts of stuff. It's going to be meaty. But to start out, we have a blank edit profile Livewire component right here that just returns a blade view. And then this is a bunch of plain vanilla HTML and CSS. We're using Tailwind for all of our styling inline here. But just take note, it's very simple. We have divs, headings, a form tag to wrap our form, our individual input elements, and then an actual submit button. And that's it. Nothing is wired up yet. It's just a simple form on the page. So let's do that and use some Livewire to wire this up. So this is an edit profile component. We're going to edit the user's profile. So the first thing we need to do is when we load this page, we want to see all the values from the database. And to do that, we're going to create public properties for each of those values. So username equals empty string, and then public bio also equals empty string. And then we'll also create a property called user that we'll set to the user model in our app models user. Okay, so these three are good to go. We can wire them up. Let's actually, we'll not wire them up yet. Okay, we're going to make a mount method. Mount is a lifecycle hook in Livewire that's going to run anytime this Livewire component boots up on the page. So inside mount, we can initialize these values with our user model. So first, let's get the user model. This arrow user equals auth user. And if this was a edit post or something, we would be saying post : find or whatever. But this is a user, so we can just get that out of auth. If the user is on a page and they're not authenticated, we're already handling that in the middleware, and that's kind of outside of the scope of this tutorial, but we're dealing with a user, so we're just going to say auth user. And now we can initialize those values. Username equals user, or this arrow user, username, and then bio is the same way. Okay, so we've gotten the user out of the database, and we've initialized these two properties from the database. We refreshed the page, and it worked, but we didn't actually fill the values because they're not bound to these input elements at all. So we need to use wire model in Livewire to do that. Wire model equals username. And then this here, this text area, is going to be wire model equals bio. Okay, refresh the page, and there we go. Now our Livewire properties are bound to these input elements. When the inputs change, the properties change. When the properties change, the inputs change. It's a really powerful little pattern here. Okay, wire model username, wire model bio. We have everything wired up for the initial load. Now let's make it so that we can modify one of these fields and hit save, and it'll save to the database. How do we do that? Okay, when this form, first, how do we intercept a form submission when the user hits the enter key or the save button? Right now it's doing a full page request. It's doing a full form submission. We want to intercept the submission with wire submit. We'll call a method called save, and then let's create that method, save. And then here we'll do all our saving work. And if you thought maybe you would need to do something like this, wire click on this input or this button, you don't have to do that because it's type submit. So when this is clicked, the browser is going to handle triggering a form submission on the form element. And it's much better to do it this way than wire click, because if your mouse or cursor is inside an input field and the user hits enter, they expect it to submit the form. And so if you just do wire submit on a form, you're covered on all bases, so it's perfect. Okay, wire submit save. Now what do we do inside save? Well, we'll get the user property, so this arrow user, and then we can call update. And then inside up, there's many different ways to do this. I don't know, I guess for our purposes here, we'll just manually update each one, because this is the safest. You don't have to worry about mass assignment or anything like that. So basically what we're doing is we're taking those values from our Livewire component and we're setting them on the user model. And now we can call this arrow user arrow save, and that'll save it to the database. So let's just check and make sure that that worked. So if I change it to Porzi or maybe Porzio and then hit save. Okay, it looks the same. Is it fine? We're going to refresh. And if this is still the value, we know it's saved to the database. We refresh and it's still there. Let's add some kind of bio. Hit save, refresh, and it's still there. Okay, so we've made the most basic, bare bones, little edit profile component with the basic Livewire properties from the database, some wire model, some wire submit. Really, really easy using forms like this in Livewire, but of course, there's so much more to it. There's so many more optimizations we can make and ways to make this more robust. And then of course, we're going to add complexity like select dropdowns and checkboxes and radios in future episodes in this series. But this is it for now. I'll see you in the next episode. So our form works great. We can save the form, we can change a field, save it, refresh, it all saves. However, there's no user feedback that the form actually submitted. So if a user's on a slow connection, they don't know if it's being submitted and they might hit save twice. And then when it succeeds, they don't know that it succeeded. And this is kind of confusing for people and causes your users kind of like stress. So let's mitigate that stress and provide them some feedback. The first thing we're going to do is that kind of loading state. So before we even do that, let's make this app slower. When we go to save it, let's sleep for 1 second. Okay, so now when we hit the save button, there's a request going out for a whole second, but we don't see it in the UI. Let's take a look at the network tab. We hit save and we're in CSS. We hit save and there it is. It's going and then it takes a full second to load and doesn't do anything. So there's a few different things that Livewire does to make this pretty nice. The first thing is it automatically disables any input fields and submit buttons when you do submit a Livewire form. So if we hit save and hammer that a bunch of times, I just clicked it 3 times, it only sent 1 submission because it disables this button entirely so that it can't be hit while we're sending something out. Take a look at this button itself. If we look in the DevTools, and here's the button right here, I'm going to hit save and watch what happens. This disabled attribute gets added to the button by Livewire automatically. So one really easy thing that we can do in Tailwind is add some conditional styling only on a disabled state. So this is just stock Tailwind, it just works. So we can say when this is disabled, let's say cursor not allowed, and that's going to make our cursor that kind of X, you'll see. So there we go. That's cursor not allowed. So that kind of tells the user that they can't check this or click this button again, or they can, but it won't do anything. And then let's also add a little bit of a fade. So we'll say cursor opacity 50, and that's going to make it transparent. So here we go. Okay, so it's not allowed and it's a little transparent. I think that looks pretty good. 50 might be kind of aggressive. So let's try this. Okay, that's a little nicer. Now we have a basic state. This is fine. This is a really easy way to just get enough feedback to get by. So you can stop here if you want. This is a fine experience, but we're going to go above and beyond. We're going to add a loading spinner, and then we're going to add a success notification. So let's start with the loading spinner. I have a loading spinner pre-built for us, so I'll put that in here. Okay, so this is just some div and SVG and Tailwind. I actually took this right from the Tailwind documentation. Tailwind has an animate spin class, wherever it is. It's on here. It's on the SVG animate spin, and this is their example SVG. I just stole it from them. So this is that SVG. I just made it styled like justified to the right. You can put it wherever you want and do whatever you want. But obviously the problem with this is that it's just showing up all the time. We only want to show it up when the form is being submitted. So there are a few ways to do this, and there's probably some kind of weird, wild Tailwind way to conditionally add like a hidden class if the parent's disabled or not, but I don't even know how to do that. And I'm just going to show you what I would do because Livewire has some utilities that make this really easy. So wire loading in Livewire is a simple little attribute you can add to any element, and it'll hide it by default on the page. And then it knows when there's a component request going out for this component, it'll show that element. So let's see that. Okay, so it's hidden from the page for us. And now if I hit save, it shows and then it disappears. But something weird happened. You saw how the positioning was all off. And this is why. Because wire loading, after it removes or sets display to none, it doesn't know what to set it back to. We have this declared as flex, but unfortunately, I'll just take it from the horse's mouth. We've worked to the ends of the earth on this feature to try to make it as seamless as possible, but this is kind of an impossible thing. So if you're using flex or inline flex or any display position other than block, I think inline block actually is the default. So wire loading works great on normal divs and H3s and anything, but if you are flex positioning the div and you have wire loading, make sure to add wire loading.flex. So now we hit save and it's back to perfect. It looks great. Okay, so we have our little loading spinner. I think that looks really good. Let's keep going to the King Salmon. Let's add the profile successfully updated message here. We're going to stick it at the bottom and only show it once that form has successfully submitted. So let's put that at the bottom here. We're going to say indicator. Okay, so here's the success indicator. It's just some basic little thing with an icon that I made, profile updated successfully. And it's showing all the time right now. Now think about this time. This has nothing to do with loading. This is something we want to show when something successfully gets submitted. How do we do that? There are so many different ways to do this. At the end of your save, you could dispatch an event like save succeeded. And then here you could maybe listen for that event, Exxon save succeeded, listen on the window, and then do something. There's plenty of different things we can do, but I'm going to show you my favorite thing to do. We're going to control the state of this success indicator in Livewire. So let's add a new property called public show success indicator. And it's going to be false by default. Okay. And then this show success indicator, when we've successfully saved it, we're going to say this show success indicator equals true. Okay. Now you might think to do something like this. If show success indicator. Let me just actually do that and show you what that would look like. End if. Okay, so now it's hidden. We save the field and then it shows up. This is okay, except what happens if they go and submit this again, or it says successfully updated? I don't know. This is the kind of thing that I personally would like to only show temporarily and then fade out after a few seconds. So it just feels like we're telling the user, hey, the profile updated successfully, and then we're gone. We deliver the message and then we're gone. Where right now the message is kind of plastered statically on the page. So instead of using Blade to toggle this, we're going to use Alpine. So Alpine has a helpful utility called xShow, where you can specify any piece of Alpine state, like maybe you have x data equals open is false or something, and you can say xShow open, and it'll honor whatever that data is. Well, fortunately in Livewire, we have access to $wire inside of Alpine. So we can say $wire.showSuccessIndicator, and we're going to set that as the xShow. And let's see what happens. Okay, so it is hidden. And now if I hit save, it's going to show up, because even though Livewire set it to true, these two are bound. Every Livewire property has an Alpine property in $wire that you can use and abuse and interact with. You can change those properties both from Livewire's PHP backend and also Alpine's front end, which is incredibly powerful. So what do we want to do? We want to, after this gets set to true, we want to wait a little bit and then set it back to false to hide it. And there are lots of different ways to do this, and I'm going to show you a way that I personally would do, knowing that it's a little bit more of an advanced maneuver, but that's what we're here for. Xeffect is an incredibly powerful tool in Alpine that, let me just show you what it does. Let's say console log effect. Okay. And then let's open up the DevTools and refresh the page, and there we go. Effect got console.logged out. We save and everything works, but that only happened once. So here's the magic of effect. Effect basically is run the code inside here and then rerun it every time one of its dependencies change. And there's no dependencies here, but check this out. Let's add a dependency. Let's console log out the value of wire show success indicator. On first load, it's false. We hit save. Now that value changed from Livewire, and now it's true, and it reran whatever we put inside that. And if we hit this again, well, it's not going to do anything because it's still true. But effect is a magical tool. So let me show you how we can use this. We're going to say if wire show success indicator, then we'll say set timeout for 3 seconds. This is just a JavaScript function called set timeout. We're going to say run this code after 3 seconds. And the code we're going to run is just set this to false. Okay. And now we refresh the page and take a look. All right, it got set to true. 3 seconds later, that set timeout happens and it gets set to false. And the best part about this approach is only one network request got sent. One request to update it to true, then Alpine sets it to false, and it doesn't trigger a network request. But that data will be synchronized on the server when there is another request. Okay, are you still following? We basically have everything we need. There's just one more thing I want to add. I want to add a transition. So let's see what transition looks like. If we just add X transition and we hit save. Okay, so it transitions in, which is cool, and then it transitions out, but it's a little wonky. I think I only want this to transition opacity. So let's see how opacity looks. Okay, it fades in and it fades out so abruptly it almost doesn't even look like a fade. So something we're going to do is add a duration to this. We'll say 2000 milliseconds. So we want this opacity fade to last 2000 milliseconds. So let's check that out. Okay. So now it's fading in for 2000 and then fading out. We only want this to fade out. So let's say transition.out.opacity duration 2000. And let's see how this looks. Okay. It shows up instantly and then it fades out for 2 seconds after that 3-second delay. And I'm totally happy with that. So this might look like a little bit of, I don't know, if it's black magic to you, you can choose your own approach, but this is what I would do. You can copy it from this course and use it in your own apps. And I don't mind this kind of complexity because it's isolated to one single spot. I'm not spewing code all over the place. This is just one single spot that deals with showing itself and hiding itself. So let's just take a look at what we've done here and how it looks. We hit save. That's great. Profile updated successfully. And then it's going to magically fade out. So I feel like this is a pretty nice reactive experience for our users. I'm totally happy with it. And there's that. That's adding a little bit of user feedback to our form. I'll see you in the next video. Okay, let's add some validation to this form so that if we remove the username field, it prevents us. It says, hey, the username field is required. So we'll start on the back end. The easiest way to add validation to a field in Livewire is to use the validate attribute. So we'll import that, Livewire attributes validate, and then you can pass in any rules you want. So we're just going to say required, and that's going to add validation to this field. And now we want to run that when we call save. So we say this arrow validate. Okay, so that's it for the back end. That's really easy. The front end is pretty easy too. We want to show some kind of validation error. So let's style this out. We'll make it a p tag, text small, and text red 500. Okay, and then something just to see what it looks like on the page. Okay, cool. So we have something there that sounds good. Now we want to conditionally render it if there is an error, and Blade makes this really easy with the error directive. So we can just say error, username, and error. Okay, and then to show the message, it provides us with this message variable. So let's try this. We remove Caleb Porzio, we hit save, and there we go. It shows the username field is required. So that's pretty good, but I think we can go one step further and show a red border around this field when there is a validation error. So we can do a kind of similar pattern where we conditionally show some classes inside the class string, but you'll find out that this gets pretty gnarly pretty quick. Like if you conditionally make this false, like don't show this on an error and then do show something else on an error, it just gets really long and complicated to read. So Laravel makes this a little bit nicer with a pretty cool directive called class. So I'll show you that. So instead of this hard-coded class string, let's say class, and then we have an array, and let's take all the contents of this class and put it inside here. And this is, for now, it's just going to combine all the classes that you add into class and spit it out as a normal class attribute. So we can test that by, I guess we just see a border, and so we know that that's working. But the cool thing about this is we can conditionally add and remove classes based on true and false. So let's say we say border red 500 true, and it's not going to show because it doesn't take precedence, but there we go. So it's true, and then if we do false, it hides. So that's pretty good because now we can just add a condition that says errors has username, then we want it to be border red, and otherwise we want it to be, I think slate 300 it was. That's the normal border, and this will be errors missing username. So these two will toggle on and off if there's an error or not. So let's see, we have our border, we remove it, we hit save, and there we go. That looks pretty good. I think we want this to be a little bit thicker on the validation border. So let's say border 2, and then this will just be border, and then we'll remove border from here entirely. Okay, so this should get us exactly what we want. We hit save, and perfect. I think visually this looks strong and good and tells the user, hey, that username field is required. You need to do something about that. Perfect. We have the visuals all set. Let's keep going and make this a little more complicated. I think the required validation is nice. However, there are other validation concerns with a username, like you don't want somebody to select a username that's already taken. For example, if I say Brock Porzio, that's already taken in the database, and we want to prevent the user from submitting a duplicated username. So Laravel makes this pretty easy. We can say unique users. And what this is going to do is make sure that the username field is unique in the users table. It's going to handle that for us. So let's try this. So if we set this to Brock Porzio and then hit save, There we go. The username has already been taken. So Laravel makes that really easy, but let me show you a new problem. If we go to set this back to Caleb Porzio, and then we hit save, it still says the username has already been taken. Like if we literally just try to resubmit this form, it throws an error because it doesn't know to ignore our current user. If you think about it for a second, it's like Laravel is just kind of naively looking in the users table for a conflict, and it finds one with what we're submitting, but it's because it was already submitted and saved. So this is just a problem, and of course Laravel has a solution for it, but that solution requires using Laravel rule objects. It's Laravel rule unique, and then you pass in users, and then you have the ignore parameter here. So we need to use this, but how can we use this inside of Livewire's attributes? Like maybe there's a way to do something like this. Well, the problem with this is PHP. This is a restriction just in PHP. When you're using attributes, you can only pass in strings and numbers and very simple syntaxes. You can't pass in runtime code like this that references things like this. You just can't do it. So that's a restriction of using these nice little attributes. So feel free to use these for simple things, but when you're doing more complex things, you need to add a rules method. So let me show you that. Rules, return, and now we can say username is equal to, and we'll say required, and then we'll take this rule unique thing over here, and we'll put that in down here. Okay, and then let's import this illuminate validation rule right up here, illuminate validation rule. Okay, then we can get rid of this entirely, and we're just gonna use rules. So this is a feature in Livewire. So I'm showing you this to show you that there are plenty of cases where you need something more complex than what you can do inside of Livewire's little validation attributes. And in those cases, use a rules method where you define a more standard, just key value pair of the fields and then all their validation rules. So we have this more robust validation rule that's going to say, check for uniqueness in users, but ignore the current user. So it's not going to prevent us from resaving the form. So let's hit save. And okay, it worked. Let's make sure that the uniqueness still works. If I change this to Brock Porzio and then I hit save, the username has already been taken. We go back to Caleb Porzio, we can save, and it allows us to save. Okay, that's perfect. I think we're good there, but let's take it one step further. And in the case of a username, it's nice to real-time validate that. So if the user tries something like Brock Porzio and then they keep filling out the form, it's one of those instances where when you're filling out a username field, you kind of anticipate or expect that your form is going to show you the validation error that it's already taken as you fill out the form. So this is super easy to do in Livewire. Really easy. Let me show you. So we have wire model. We just add .blur. And now what that's going to do is instead of waiting for the form to be submitted to send that network request, let me show you in the dev tools. Let's go to network. Instead of waiting, as soon as we blur out of this field, it's going to send a request to the server to basically just update this field. So what we want to do is hook into that update and run validation. And there are a few ways to do that. There is actually an updated hook inside of Livewire that you could use to run your own validation, but let me show you the nicest, easiest way. And that is just to go back to validate, but this time with no rules. We're keeping our rules here, and that's totally fine, but we're just adding validate, a naked validate with no parameters, just to say, hey, keep this property under validation so that every time the front end attempts to update this property, run any validation rules associated with it. So this is a very common pattern that I think I'm mostly going to use in my applications is a rules method, because often I need those rule objects, and then just a validate attribute just to make sure that that property has its real-time validation. You don't have to use this if you're not doing something like real-time validation. We're already validating the whole form down here, but this is nice for just this little need. So let's take a look and see if it works. I'm just going to remove the field and hit tab, and there we go. The username field is required. We can go back there, we can do Brock Porzio and hit tab, and it's going to say, oh, that's already taken. Caleb Porzio, hit tab, and now we're good. Then we can go ahead and submit the form. So that's validation. That's complicated validation with rule objects, the validate attribute, and adding some real-time validation with .blur. You could also do .live if you want it to be truly real-time, like as we remove this, we get validation as we're updating that field So feel free to do that. It's going to cost you more with the server. It's going to send more requests, and it might be a little intrusive for your users. So I think blur is fine. And actually, I had it set to live, and I saw something else that I think is really important to note right now. Watch this. Every time I hit backspace, it's sending a request to update that field. But take a look at the save button. Our loading indicator is happening every single time a request is being sent to the server. That's not ideal. I only want this loading indicator to show when the user is actually submitting the form, not when they're just updating a field. And by default, wire loading, that's just going to apply to any time this LiveWire component is loading. It doesn't scope it to save automatically for you. There's a really simple fix here, and it's called wire target. It's an easy way to target any loading directives to a specific method or property or anything you want. So we're going to say only show this loading indicator when the user is actually clicking something that calls the save method. So let's try this now. It's still live, but we don't see that loading indicator. And then if we go to submit the form, we do see the loading indicator. So that's a helpful tip when you're using wire loading. If it's for a specific action, target it to that specific action. All right, that's real-time validation. That's everything you need to know about the basics of validation in a form in a LiveWire app. See you in the next video. So take a look at the LiveWire component we have so far. We have a few different public properties, validation rules, some stuff in the mount, save, and then render. It's getting kind of big, and this is for a form with 2 input fields. What's it going to be like when there's 10 of these things and 10 more little variables for showing an indicator or a dialogue or something like that? It starts to feel big and a little annoying to work in. So for this reason, in LiveWire version 3, we introduced the concept of form objects, a way to extract things about a form from a LiveWire component into a dedicated class that you can reuse between other components and keep your components kind of focused on the live parts, the display parts, like show success indicator. I think show success indicator belongs on this LiveWire component because it's specific to it. But things about validating specific fields related to a model, that's not necessarily specific to this component. So let's extract a form object and put these things into it. So you open up the terminal, PHP artisan, LiveWire form, and we're going to call this profile form. I like to keep these kind of generic where this is very specific, edit profile. But profile form, that might be used in a create profile LiveWire component. We don't know, so let's just create it. All right, that made it an app LiveWire forms profile form. Let's take a look at that, app LiveWire forms profile form. All right, so this is the scaffolding here. It's just a class that extends form and has a few imports for us. So this part is kind of nice. You can basically just take a lot of your LiveWire component and paste it into this form object. It's almost like a nested LiveWire component at times. You don't, not entirely, it's pretty much dedicated to data, not display or anything, but you can see that we can just take huge swaths of our component and just paste it in just like that. We'll add a few import statements here, import user, import user and import rule. And that's going to be illuminate validation rule, okay. And then mount, we'll see what we do with mount in a second. Let's take this save over though. We're just going to take the contents of it because this form object, it can be used for just storing properties if you like and rules, or you can also use it to do the persisting to the database. And to do that, we could call this save. However, I probably will end up using this form object for both a create page and an edit page. So I'm going to dedicate this method to updating. Then we can add one later called create if we want. And we'll take most of what's inside here and stick it inside this update method, okay? And then we haven't added anything related to the form object in the class yet. I just wanted to show you how you're pretty much just grafting stuff from your component into the profile form to kind of isolate it and make it a little more focused. Okay, so how do we reference this form? You reference form objects by setting them as public properties. This is going to be profile form, and we'll call this form, and then we'll import this. Okay, so now let's just skip to save. We're going to handle mount in a second, but now when save, we just call this form arrow update. And then that's going to handle all the validation. It's going to handle all the storage in the database and saving the actual thing to the database. And then we can handle more display type concerns like showing a success indicator back in our LiveWire component. All right, so on mount, we're setting user and username on this component, And now we want to set them on our profile form. I should note, profile forms are not just nested Livewire components. There is no mount method to hook into. In a situation like this where you want to fill a profile form with stuff from your mount method, it's actually pretty straightforward. You just create a simple method. Name it whatever you want. We're going to call it set user. This is going to pull in the user model, and then we can call it from here. This arrow form arrow set user, and then we'll pass in the user from, our user is just out of the auth because it's a user. Okay, so auth user, and then let's get back to this. So now this whole chunk we'll put inside of here. This is kind of our pseudo mount method. We're just forwarding the user onto set user to sort of set up this component. I'm calling it set user though, because think about it. If this was a create user page or create profile or something, which with a user you wouldn't necessarily do, but let's say this was a blog post or something. For creation, you're not setting initial values, so you don't always want this to run like you do in a mount method. Okay, so mount this form set user. So we've set the form as a property, we've filled it with some data inside of mount, and then we defer the actual updating to the save method, and then everything else lives in here. All our properties, our validation rules, setting up the user, and then updating it in the database. So let's load it in the browser and see if it's any good. Okay, I just refreshed and everything got erased. Well, why is that? There's a very simple explanation for this. If you look at the Blade template, you'll notice that everywhere we're referencing properties that don't exist anymore. We're saying username when there is no username property. There's a form property. So anytime you reference username, like when you're looking in the error bag or when you're wire modeling, you now have to say form dot because it lives inside the form property. And we'll do the same for bio, form dot bio. Save it, refresh, and there we go. It still works. So moment of truth, if everything worked as planned, I should be able to remove this, hit tab, and it'll say it's required. Check that out. And let's make sure that our unique validation rule still works. Username's already been taken. Make sure ignore works. It does. We can save it. And our form is back to being peachy keen, but now we've cleaned it up a ton and we can reuse this throughout different Livewire components in our app. You can even reuse it outside of Livewire components if you really want. But yeah, so that's that. I like this pattern a lot. I do it even for small forms. I started out not thinking that this was going to be a pattern I use all the time, but it really is because it is so nice to create a dedicated class that is totally specific to a model and the data associated with that model and all its validation and all its persistence. I like this pattern a lot. It's very similar to request objects. If you're familiar with those in Laravel, this is sort of the Livewire equivalent. All right, so that's form objects. See you in the next video. All right, so this episode is all about making your form accessible. And what do I mean by accessibility? I mean the ability for any user with any disability or not using your application to be able to use it and interact with it well. So that includes people who are hearing impaired, visually impaired, colorblind, anything like that. If you're using a screen reader, you should still be able to use your form and get as much feedback as possible. And unfortunately, when we just write code the way we think to without considering those types of utilities, if you just kind of naively throw in elements and classes and mix in interactivity the way that you just think to, it isn't very accessible, and I'll show you why. So we're going to dig into a few different accessibility tools. We'll actually use a screen reader, and we'll add a few different attributes and tweak a few things on this page to make it way more accessible. So the first thing, but you don't even, like, screen readers are a little bit clumsy to use when you're not used to them. So we're going to start with something really easy. This is just an easy way to get an idea about how a screen reader might view your page. So if you go open to DevTools and then go to Elements and then Accessibility, enable full page accessibility tree, reload DevTools. Now you have this little man in the top right. You can click him and check this out. Instead of elements, you get an accessibility tree of what a screen reader would actually say or see when they're parsing your document. So take a look. We got this form. We got heading, username, and then we have text box. But notice that there's nothing inside text box. There's no label. So a screen reader wouldn't actually know what this text box is for at all. And a user using it would have to read everything in order to just guess that this is a username because username appeared above it. But again, the screen reader doesn't know what the actual label is. So there's tons of ways to add labels to input elements. So let's just go to our input element and I'll just show you the easiest. Aria label equals Username, we'll just say, oh man, username. Okay. Now we refresh, we use our little picker, and now it has a label. There's other ways you could add an ID to this, call it foo, and then aria labeled by, and then specify foo, and that way you can reuse an existing label on the page. And let's just look at that, make sure that that worked. Okay, so it did, it still has a label, but I'd say that these are sort of last resorts, actually using aria labels. You'll see this aria prefix a lot. It's for assistive technologies to give them more information. It generally doesn't change the behavior of a page at all. It just gives technologies like screen readers more information. But fortunately, there's actually an element we can use, the label element, to make this process easier and give us some more behavior. Notice here when we click username, it doesn't highlight this field. And generally, users expect that they can click the heading of an input and it'll actually focus the field. And that's how you use label elements. So I'll show you two ways to use label elements. The second one, the one we're going to end up on, is what I like the most, but this one is probably the most common and useful. So we'll make this a label and we'll say this is for username, and then we'll give this an ID of username. So this is a pattern you're going to see a lot, and this is what I recommend in most scenarios. Create a label, you say what it's for, and then you reference that username right here, that ID. Let's take a look. Okay, so it's labeled username, and now if I click on this, now we focus our input. So it actually changed the interactivity of the page a little bit. So this is good, but my issue with it is you have to create a bespoke ID and then link them in two places. It's another thing to have to name, it's another thing to have to manage. So personally, my favorite thing to do, I'll show you this, is wrap the whole thing in a label element, and then it'll all be taken care of automatically. So forget about aria labels, labeled by, label for. You can just wrap the element that you're wrapping this input in, you can just wrap it in label and it'll be labeled for you. So we get the behavior in the browser, and if we take a look here, the text box is labeled. So everything is labeled well, and now it's going to read really well. So those are labels, they're very important. Let me show you a few other concerns that aren't actually going to show up as well inside of this accessibility tree. This tree is useful for the basics, but to really understand how a screen reader behaves and what a screen reader would do when it's actually using your form, you kind of need to use a screen reader. So I'm going to show you how to do that. In your Mac, if you go to Preferences, System Preferences, search VoiceOver, and then click VoiceOver, you can enable VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on system settings.
There you go. Now VoiceOver is talking to us. It's basically speaking out everything on the page. This is going to be a little distracting for me recording, but we're going to push through. You'll see when you use these things, they are distracting. All right, the first thing I want to draw your attention to with the screen reader, before I do anything on the page and it starts talking really fast, I'm going to remove the contents of this username field and then get that validation triggered. So if I remove the contents and then trigger validation, I'm going to show you a few problems with it. Remove the contents.
Edit text. A little bit about myself.
Notice the screen reader has no idea about that validation error. It's not reading it to us after we tabbed away. If we try to submit the form, there's still validation. It doesn't tell us there's validation. So if you're using a screen reader and you're not looking at the page, you have no idea that there's a validation error. In fact, if we go back to the field, it doesn't say anything about a validation error at all. So a visual user is going to see clearly there's a validation error, but somebody non-visual, just using audio, they're not going to know anything about that. So let's add some utilities to make that work.
VoiceOver off.
I'm going to turn VoiceOver off for a minute so that it's kind of out of our hair. Okay, back to VS Code. Okay, so again, there was a few problems. I think the one we'll solve that's easiest is when you have an error message right here, you want to also say that the input is invalid, and there's a really easy way to do that. So we're going to say error, let's actually do this. Let's do this, and then we can add all of the ARIA attributes we need to. ARIA invalid equals true. And now, when somebody using a screen reader goes and highlights over that field, if it's invalid, it will say it's invalid. But you also want to read out the validation message when they hover onto this field as well. So this is what you use ARIA described by for. And sorry, you can use described by and pass in an ID, like if we had an ID here, or you could just reuse the whole name itself. So we could just say ARIA description, And then we already have the message in this variable because we're inside error username, and we're just going to spit it out. So this way, if somebody tabs back onto an error field, they'll get read that message. And let me actually just show you that. We'll open up VoiceOver again.
Chrome,
Okay.
main, heading left, username. The username field
And
is
now
required. Edit a little bit
we
about
refresh,
my name.
okay.
Heading left, one password. Caleb
We
Porzio.
remove it.
Select edit text.
We go
a little
away.
bit about myself. Insertion at end of text.
And now if I go
You are
back
currently
to
one
it,
password menu available.
it
Press
should
the down
read
arrow
it.
key to
One
select.
password is going to make this
You are currently
annoying.
on a text field. To enter, edit.
Let me see if
one
I can
password
try
menu
this again.
available. Edit username. The username
Okay,
field is
username.
required.
Username field is
Invalid data.
required.
Edit text.
Invalid
one password
data.
menu available.
Yep,
Press
okay.
the down arrow key to VoiceOver off.
So there we go. One password makes this a little bit weird in this scenario, but you just saw that by adding these two things, a screen reader is now going to say, hey, that field's invalid, and this is why. So that's perfect. All right, what else? Something that we noticed is that when we triggered a validation error as we were filling out the form, it didn't read it out to us. It didn't say, hey, there's a validation error. And the same, even if you didn't have real-time validation and you hit save, the screen reader wouldn't be updated with that new information. So there's a really useful ARIA attribute called live. So if we say ARIA live equals, there's a few different options here. There's off, there's polite, and there's assertive. Assertive. So what's going to happen here is if we have ARIA live and we use assertive, when this element changes on the page, in our case, it's appearing and disappearing. When it appears on the page, it's going to interrupt anything else and read itself out. You can also make that polite, and polite will wait till the screen reader is done with what it's currently doing to read it out. Most times you want polite, but in our scenario, we're using real-time validation. We actually want assertive so that it shows so that it speaks out the validation error as soon as the user tabs away from the field. So we're going to use ARIA live assertive, and let's see what happens here. Open up VoiceOver again.
Chrome. Form
Okay.
Caleb Porzio. Selected.
So we're selected.
Heading level 3.
We clear
File.
it.
The username field is
Whoops.
required.
There
You
we
are
go.
currently on a text area.
It just read it out to
Password
us.
menu
So let's fill it back out, tab away, it's fine. Okay, remove it, tab away.
A little bit about myself. Insertion at beginning of text. The username field
The
is
username
required.
field is required.
You are
So there we
currently on
go.
a text area.
It read it to us, so now we know we can go
The
back
username field
and it'll
is
tell us we have
required.
invalid
Edit
data.
one password menu available. Press the down arrow.
Come on, VoiceOver. Okay. Great. So that's ARIA Live. Super, super useful. And there's one more thing that I want to show you with this page. When somebody using a screen reader goes down to save and they hit enter to save it, there's visual feedback that it's saved, but there's no audio feedback that it was saved. So we can actually use the same strategy, this ARIA Live here, and just stick it right down here. We'll say ARIA Live, we'll make this one polite on our success indicator. And now it should actually read out the contents of our success indicator when this save button is clicked. It's pretty neat. So let's check this out in VoiceOver and then we'll be done with VoiceOver.
Chrome. Form. One password
Okay.
menu available. Edit text.
Good there,
A little bit
good
save
there.
button.
Click the
You
save
are currently
button.
on a button. Group. This item is dimmed. Profile updated successfully.
Profile updated successfully. So there, it was read out to the user.
VoiceOver off.
And yeah, there we go. So now a screen reader using this page is going to have everything they need to know. They're going to have the labels for the inputs. They're going to be alerted when there's validation messages. They're going to be reminded of those validation messages when they highlight these fields. And when they submit the form, they're going to be given some audio confirmation that it was saved successfully. So these are a few simple things you can do. These ARIA Live, ARIA description, ARIA invalid, labels, things like that. It can be a little confusing. I totally understand that. The thing I want to tell you is just do the best you can. Open up VoiceOver and test something out. So accessibility can feel like such an intimidating area of web development, and I don't think it has to be. I think you just do your best and use tools that visually impaired people use, and that'll be illuminating for you. You'll be able to really understand how things work. And when you start to break it down, they're not that complicated. It's just like anything else. You have to start using it. You have to start learning it. So that was a quick detour from our original form mission, just to really take some time and focus on accessibility and hammer some of these points home. You're going to see them crop up as we go. We're going to refer back to accessibility, make sure that we're doing the right things on our page in the series. But yeah, this is just as important to nail inside your forms as anything else. So see you in the next video. All right, we have a solid base for our form, but we still only have 2 input fields. And how realistic is that? We're going to add more input fields with different input types. And in this video, we're going to tackle radios. So here we go. We're going to do a little receive emails radio that they can hit yes or no. So let's start with the styling of this radio. We're in our edit profile blade component, go down to our bio, and let's just copy this as a starting point. So instead of bio, we're going to say receive emails, receive marketing emails. I don't know. No, receive emails. Let's try that. Okay, receive emails. Well, it's still a text area, and that's not what we want. So we're going to convert this text area into an input. And what's the type? It's going to be radio. Let's just see what that looks like on the page. All right, it's a single radio button. And of course, we need two of these, one for yes, one for no. So let's make two of these, and we'll say yes and no here, and just see what it looks like. Okay, it looks like garbage, so let's keep making it look better. We'll wrap this inside a div, and we'll add a little bit of flexbox action here. We'll say flex, and what do we want? We want like a gap of 6 between these maybe, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, that's pretty good. However, that flexbox is applying to 4 elements, our inputs and then our labels. So let's go even further and wrap these in divs themselves and see what that looks like. Looks pretty good, but we could use maybe some more space here. So while we're at it, let's make these divs their own little flex containers. We'll add item center, and that's going to center the, see how that radio looks a little higher than the words? We're going to center them vertically so that they look the same, and then we'll add like a gap of 2 in there. So gap 2, and then let's put these like this just so it looks a little bit better. Okay. All right, we broke something because I erased that. Okay. All right, I think that looks pretty good. We have our radio buttons, but there's all sorts of things broken about them. What's going on here? What is a radio button? A radio is when only one can be selected. So if this is selected, I should be able to click this, and that's not selected. But right now, that's not the case. They're not bound together. There's no way for HTML to know that these should independently interact with each other. And note that this is different than every other input type. Any other input type, you have an input that has its own name and wire model and value. Radios are unique. They're different. They end up with the same name when you want them linked together. So let's say receive emails is the name here. And then we're going to give it the exact same name. Okay, and now they should be linked together. When I click one, if I click the other, it unclicks that and it clicks that. Perfect. Okay, so let's keep going here. If I click on yes, it did select it actually, but if I click on no, it doesn't select no. That's because these are just words. They're not linked to these inputs at all. Remember how when we used labels to link these labels to their inputs? Well, these labels are not linked to their inputs, and that's a really easy fix. We can just convert this div into a label, just like we've done for our other inputs. We have a label and then an input beneath it. We have a label, an input beneath it, and a screen reader will use these words to associate as a label with these inputs, so it'll read really well. All right, let's see this. Okay, that's much better. We're pretty much there. I think there's one other bit that, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So we have them linked just like this, and I'm fine with that. But one little structural thing I want to point out, there's a wrapping label and then labels beneath them. And you can actually do this. I tested in VoiceOver. It does work, but it's a little odd. It's not typically how you would structure an input like this. This is really an input group. There's multiple inputs inside of this generic container, and we want to label them individually, but we also want a label for the group of them. And so the way you typically do this in HTML is with a field set tag. And then instead of an H3, you use legend. Whoops. And now this field set will associate all these inputs together, and it'll give them a group with the label of whatever you made legend, in this case, receive emails. So we refresh and everything looks pretty much the same, except we lost some gap here. This is just a note about legend. It's kind of annoying, but the legend element doesn't honor flex gapping. So I wrap it in a div and then we're just taken care of. So there's our gap again. We're visually set. A screen reader knows how to recognize each of these inputs is a yes and no under the group of receive emails. So Radios are a little more involved than other inputs, as you can clearly see, because you use multiple whenever you're using them, and that means you have to deal with a few little naming things, labeling things, and putting them inside of a field set. So we're almost there. However, these radios are native radio buttons. This is just the styling of the native browser, where these inputs, we made them look a little bit nicer for our page. With this, we're just getting whatever browsers decide it should look like. And for radios, it doesn't look too bad. I'd say my only criticism is it's pretty small. Like, these are very small. And also, we're using blue for the color of our page, so the default blue looks pretty good. But if we were using purple, that blue, you might want to be purple. So how do you style these radio elements? You can't just add classes to them like you do to other input text types or things like that. So when I run across this, something I do in pretty much every application I'm working on is I use Tailwind's Forms plugin. It basically hijacks the browser's native form styling and gives it some decent styling by default, and then allows you to customize these inputs that normally you can't customize, but it allows you to with some CSS magic. I don't even know how it works. If you want to use the CDN, go ahead and grab that. Otherwise, if you're using Vite to build your Tailwind inside your app, it's really easy. Just go to Tailwind, look up the install instructions for the Forms plugin, and it'll show you how to add that into your pipeline. Okay, so we saved that. Let's refresh it and see what the radios. Okay, so the radios are just bigger now. They're bigger, they have better focus rings, they're blue. We could easily change the color with Tailwind. So I think these look a lot better. And the change is subtle, but it's extremely apparent when you use something like a select dropdown. So let's just throw a select dropdown inside here, select, and we're going to give it a single option called foo or something. Okay. We refresh. So this is with Tailwind's Forms plugin. So we can easily grab, like take this input, we can easily grab all of this styling from our input and throw it directly on this select and make those native selects look beautiful, just like the rest of our app. How nice is that? Look how nice that is. They even have a nice icon that they've added for us. It's offset perfectly. We can change things like padding and border, and now our selects look really good. And just a reminder, without the Forms plugin, okay, it actually looks decent because selects are kind of styled now by default, but this doesn't look good at all. And there's plenty of other things you can't do, like radios, we can't style them, checkboxes, we can't style them. But yeah, throw the Forms plugin in any app you're working on, basically. It's so darn useful. All right, so I think with that out of the way, we have our styling pretty much set and all our HTML structure pretty much set. Let's go inside Profile Form and let's work on getting the back end going with the front end. Okay, so in the back end, this is our form object reminder where we just have our username and bio. We're going to add a third field. Let me show you my user model in this app. I have a few different fields here. Receive emails, we're going to get to these later, but we just care about receive emails, and it's cast to a Boolean. So in the database, you can store this as whatever you want, a timestamp, a Boolean, and then we can cast it to something like a Boolean to make sure that in our app, we're always dealing with a clean Boolean value. So receive values, let's make a new public variable, and instead of bio, we'll call this receive emails, and we'll set this to false by default. Just in case you're using this for a create form, you generally end up with default values. So receive emails there. And then down here, when we set this out of the database, instead of user bio, it's user receive emails. And same here, instead of this bio, instead of this bio, it's receive emails. And then we're going to do the inverse when we're actually setting it into the database from our Livewire component. We're going to just call it receive emails. Okay. And one little note here, you'll notice that most other times when I'm creating a public property, like when I had that show success indicator, I'm using camel case because that's the convention for Laravel and a lot of PHP. So I do this for pretty much every public property. It's camel case. However, you might think, oh, well, to stick with convention, I should call it receive emails. The problem with this is now you're dealing with a camel case variable here and then a snake case variable from Eloquent, because Eloquent's going to use whatever the column name is in your database. So just something that I like to do is just keep them consistently snake cased properties or variables around your application. Your life is just going to be easier. So just to remind you what we just did, we created a new property called receive emails that we're going to bind to that radio. and then we set it in our Livewire component from the database. And let's just DD this value out to show you that it does exist, just to prove it to you. And there it is. It's false. Okay. So we set that on our Livewire component. We do anything we want to do in our Livewire component. Then when a user hits save, we set it to the database from the Livewire's value, and then we hit save and everything should be good to go and saved into the database. So that's only the back end part. We haven't wired it up to the front end. Let me just show you that, yeah, there's no value here. So how do we wire up radio inputs to values in Livewire? Well, Livewire makes this as simple as it can, but there is still a few gotchas. So let me show you. Let's do wire model, and then this is going to be receive emails. So just like we're duplicating name here, we're duplicating wire model. And this is unique. You're not going to see this in any other input element. You're only going to see this with radios. And let's see what happens by default, because in a perfect world, it just does everything for us, but we refresh and it doesn't. So here's the deal. For radio inputs and checkboxes, you need a value so that you know which one is checked. And often you set this to something like yes or true, and then value equals false, right? The problem is, how does Livewire know whether or not you want true to be a Boolean or a string? Because by default, any input value in a browser is just a string. It doesn't know about numbers or Booleans or anything like that. When we say value equals true, it's no different than saying value equals yes. And when this is set inside our component, it's going to pull it in as a string. You'll probably get an error because it should be a Boolean or something, or actually you won't because we didn't type it as a Boolean. It's just going to be a string, and it's going to mess up your application. So there's a little utility that I use almost every time I'm building a radio button called .boolean. It's a modifier in both Alpine and Livewire. If you're using Alpine, you can say xmodel.boolean. There's a few other ones. You can cast xmodel or wire model values to numbers if you want them to be integers instead of strings, but you have to do that because by default, inputs are strings. So if you want it to be a number, add .number. If you want it to be a Boolean, if you want this value to come back to the server as a Boolean instead of a string, call it true and then add .boolean. So that's a little radio button trick. Let's see if everything worked. Okay, it didn't work. We have receive emails here. I see the problem, but we didn't add that form dot prefix because it's in a form object and it's nested. So it has to be form dot receive emails. Perfect. I'm glad I caught that right away and didn't have to re-record this thing. Receive emails. No, that's what it was by default. If we hit yes, okay, it seems to work. We hit save. Everything stays the same. Let's hit refresh and it preserved our value out of the database. So there you go. There's a few tricks with radio things to understand, some markup things with field sets and legends, some wire model things and value and name and blah, blah, blah. But the back end, you can pretty much treat it as any other property. And that's the way I like it. It just stays clean, just like anything else. We're just setting it into the database. So that's radios. Let's tackle checkboxes in the next video. See you there. Okay, we tackled radios. Let's tackle checkboxes. We have a receive emails thing here where the user can say yes or no. What I want to do is if they say yes, I want to show them some checkboxes so they can select the type of emails they want. So let's just take this entire radio bit, duplicate it, and this is going to be our checkbox bit. So instead of receive emails, we're going to be saying email type. I don't know. That's not a great title, but we're not here to make great titles. Email type. And now inside here, we have two radio buttons. We don't want them to be radios. We want them to be checkboxes. And for value, they're not associated anymore. A checkbox has its own internal state of true and false. Instead of radios, there can be 10 radios for the same name. So you have to decide what those names are. For checkboxes, they're independent. They're not like radios. They're totally not linked. So let's remove value entirely. And we can even get rid of Boolean now because we're not providing a value. Livewire handles that for us automatically. All right, so we're not going to worry about wire modeling to the right property. We're just going to get the styling the way we want it. Let's see what this looks like. Okay, it looks pretty bad. We have true and true because I said checkboxes and not checkbox. Okay, yeah, now we have some checkboxes. Those look pretty nice. Let's just make them a little bit rounded because we're using Tailwind's Forms plugin. We can just use Tailwind to style our boxes, which is so nice. How cool is that? You could make them any color you want, any rounded, anything. I love it. And it has these nice little icons that Tailwind adds for us because Tailwind is so nice. Did you know that? All right, so these are checkboxes. Clearly, they're already wire modeled. They're wire modeled to the other thing, but let's keep going with the styling. The first one, we're going to say, do you want general updates or do you also want marketing offers? And then let's see what that looks like. General updates, marketing offers. Yeah, I think these should probably be on separate lines. So instead of using this flex, we'll say flex col. And that'll make them columns. And now they're a little too spread apart. So let's try gap 2. And I think that looks better. Okay, receive emails, email type. We might not even need to label this, but whatever. Again, we're not here to make labels. General offers, marketing offer, general updates, marketing offers. So that's pretty good. Let's wire those up in the back end first, and then we'll make this field conditional based on if they selected to receive emails or not. So let's open up our form object. And then in here, we need 2 more fields. So receive emails, and now we need receive updates and receive offers. And these are just the same as the receive emails field. They're in the database. They're just Booleans. So receive updates, receive offers. And then inside our HTML, let's make those receive updates and offers. Receive updates and receive offers. Okay. And now here we have receive emails. Let's duplicate that twice. And then here, let's duplicate this twice. Let's see if we can use some cursor magic to make this a little bit easier. Receive updates and receive offers. Okay, nice. So we have those 2 fields added to our form object, and now we can set them from the database and we can set them back to the database. We've wire modeled them hopefully properly. And let's just see that this all works. Should be pretty straightforward. Nothing is set by default. If we enable general updates, we save the form and it successfully saved. We refresh and that's still selected. So these are all wired up, and that's checkboxes in a nutshell. But let's go one step further and let's just show you how in a scenario like this, you might want to hide all of that when the user says, I don't want to receive emails at all. So we can do that really easily with Alpine. So here's our field set for email type. Let's just add a little X show in Alpine. You might think to do the toggling in Blade, and I would caution you against that because to me, this doesn't feel like something that needs to go to the server to do. It's going to make your app feel a little bit slower, and that's annoying. And it's kind of unnecessary. Like you would then have to make sure that this triggers a network request when you change it to re-render Blade. This is where Alpine is perfect. You say xShow, and now we want to access the value of form.receive emails inside Alpine. And that's really easy with $wire. You've seen me do that before. $wire is your gateway into your LiveWire component from Alpine. So when you're inside Alpine, $wire.form.receive emails, we already know this is a Boolean, so we can just do that. We could say, if they're receiving emails, show it. If not, hide it. Okay, so it's yes, and then if we say no, it hides. And then if we click it again, it shows, it hides, it shows. That's it. There's all sorts of things that you could do to make this more advanced. I'm actually totally shooting from the hip here. Let's just see what Xcollapse does. You could do that if you wanted it to kind of animate in and out, but honestly, these types of things aren't generally necessary for something like this. Just stick with a little toggle on and off. You could add some opacity transition if you want. I'm going to show you that, but I'm not going to use it. Transition.opacity, and let's just see. Okay, yeah, it's a little weird when it changes the height. If you transition opacity out, it just doesn't look that good. So we're just not going to use transitions because we don't need it here. But this is it, just a tiny little sprinkle of Alpine. And now we have beautiful reactivity where they can select their preferences if they say yes, and then if they say no, it's hidden from them. I didn't do anything in the server to make sure that if receive emails is no or false, then unset these two. You can easily do that. When you go to persist something to the database, you can do whatever you want. You can say, if receive emails is false, then set these both to false in the database. But in general, I'd probably just set these all anyway to kind of remember their preferences. And then when you go to send an email, you just don't send an email if they don't have receive emails. You do that conditional elsewhere. So that is the way that I would tackle this and checkboxes in a form and conditional fields in general. This is how I would handle conditional fields, whether it's conditional selects or anything. This is a really useful pattern. So that's checkboxes. See you in the next video. All right, we got our radios and checkboxes. It's time for the select dropdown. And we're going to add a little country field here so that a user can fill out their country. And I think visually it's going to be closest to the username field, so I'll probably just copy that. And we're also going to make it required, kind of like username, because I think it's the only other one that it feels like it makes sense to make it required. So let's go into our Blade file. Let's find that whole username field here, right here, and then we're going to paste it below bio. Okay, and then let's change the label to country. And then instead of form.username, we're going to say form.country in all the places that we reference that. Okay, and now it's a text input right now. Maybe we'll leave it as, no, we're not going to leave it as a text input for demoing. We're just going to change it to a select right away. So we have an open select tag now, and we'll just close up that select. And let's just add an option called choose your country here. Just see what it looks like. Okay, so we got a country field. Select dropdown looks good, works good. Reminder, here's going to be my big select disclaimer. You're going to be tempted to make fancy selects like multi-selects and tags and Ajax-driven stuff. You're going to be tempted to do all sorts of things, and I'm going to say resist that temptation as much as you possibly can. And oftentimes that select drop, that multi-select you want, can just be a list of checkboxes, or it could be that 3 select or 4 select, could be radios. There's so many better things to use than selects. But when you need to use a select, stick with the native one, avoid the third-party libraries and custom building your own. I'm going to build all that out on future screencasts so that you can see how to do it properly. It's not simple and it's not free when it comes to complexity. I get that sometimes it's necessary, but more times than not, I've made mistakes of reaching too far for custom stuff and third-party libraries like Select2 when I should have just managed forms with the basic built-in inputs because they're going to work on every device. You might think, oh, this looks kind of bad. It looks like native-y. And that's true, but it's predictable. It works really well. You're not going to come up with overflow issues. It'll actually flow outside of the page itself because Mac OS and Chrome, they know how to do it right. And if you look at it on a phone, it's going to be beautiful. The user can drag around and find their option. It's just stick with the natives. Okay, so we got that select in there. We got a single option. We want to add a bunch of options for all the different countries. So I'm just going to paste in a short list of countries here that we're going to use to drive out these options. So we're going to say option, option. Okay, now for each of these, you could have a value, and then this will be what displays in the option, and then you could have the value that actually gets set on the Livewire property and in your database. Like, I don't know why I said CA for US, but yeah, so you could have these abbreviations if you want, or for us, we're just going to actually use the full country names because that's just what we're doing. But again, you can use abbreviations if that floats your boat. But choose your country and then a list of countries. Let's see what that looks like. And just to show you what I mean by that overflow thing, check this out. If you wrote this yourself, you wouldn't get that. It would be cut off from the page and it'd be a whole thing to deal with and you'd have to do all sorts of fancy stuff. So you got the list of countries. The choose your country is actually, here's the thing about selects. There's no placeholder on a select. On inputs, you can add a placeholder attribute and it'll show up when the field is empty as sort of a description. With something like a select, you don't get placeholder, so you can make kind of a pseudo placeholder by having an empty value, calling it selected so that it's selected by default, and then adding disabled. And now, watch this. There we go. So now it's going to select the first available option, and it's going to say choose your country at the top. Okay. So that's just kind of a little placeholdery label for you. Yeah. All right. So how do we wire this up to the back end? Well, we did everything we needed on the front end with form.country. Let's go into profile form and add the new field for country. So new public property called country, and we'll just set this to an empty string, I guess, by default. And then here we're going to do country. And then down here, we do country as well. And country is just a string in the database. And then we refresh. And that's that. Let's just see if it worked. We didn't add any validation or anything, but let's just try. We choose Canada. We hit save. Looks like it's saved. We refresh and Canada is chosen. So it's all wired up. I think I am going to add a little bit of validation for country. Let's just say country is required. So we're just going to add a little required field here. Just make sure that country is required. We're going to do a little bit more advanced validation for actually validating it's within the list of approved countries in our list. We'll do that in another video because I think that's a whole interesting thing on its own. But for now, I don't know. We have a select dropdown. You can select stuff. We have validation all set up. And yeah, okay, one quick note on validation. This is a required field, and this is a required field. Something I wanted to mention earlier in the series, but I didn't. It's helpful for your users to see which fields are required. Like, have you ever think about user stress. When you're filling out a form and let's say it asks you for your middle name, you want to know, is this thing required or not? But you don't know until you submit the thing. It's nice to know what's required up front. And generally to do that, you add a little star here. So let's just add that in while we're here. We're going to go up to username, and you can just do something like this, username star, and that's fine. But I think it's going to look a little nicer if we give it some decoration. So let's just say text red 500 and see what that looks like. So now that says this is required. I think that's a little loud though. It feels visually too loud. So let's just bump that opacity down to 75 to just mute it a little bit. And there, I think that's pretty pleasant. It's still visible and it denotes that this is a required field. One thing though, this is the label for our input. So a screen reader, when it's reading it out, is going to say username star and then the thing. And maybe you want that, maybe you don't. In general though, I add something like aria hidden equals true to little visual decorations like this so that they don't muddy up a screen reader reading it out. So let's take our little asterisks and let's go down here. And I don't know if I pronounced that right. Asterisks, who knows? And add that here as well. Okay, so now it's very clear which of these fields are required visually. Okay, that selects. Let's beef up the select and generate the list from the back end and also validate it and make sure that the value is within that list from the back end. We're going to use enums to do it. It's going to be fun. I'll see you in the next video. Okay, we have our country list dropdown, but right now we look at the HTML. It's pretty simple. We just have full names for the options and we're storing those in the database. And in general, you end up often wanting to do something like this, where the value is some abbreviated key or something that you would store in the database, and then this label is something that would live inside your application that you could change. Like this wouldn't change, but this might change. I don't know. So first, let's fill out these labels for these countries, because in general, this is how I would do this kind of thing. And let's just make sure this all works. It should work fine because right now country is just a string column in our database. So we should be able to just change this to something like Mexico, hit save. See, it saves, refresh, and everything still works. Okay, so this is obviously not a complete list of countries, and there's oftentimes where you have things like countries, states, time zones, maybe zip codes, user roles, all sorts of things in your app that don't really change. It's just a set of data. And you could put those in a separate table in your database, and that's another option. That's another path, and feel free to do that. But for fixed data, whenever I see fixed data in an application, my brain says enum, which is short for an enumeration. So this episode is all about enums in PHP. They've been around since PHP 8.1, so they're pretty new, but they're really useful, and I love using them for fixed data drop-down menus. So we're going to do that. Let's create an enum in our application. We're going to go to app, and we're going to make an entirely new folder called enums to store all these in, and then a new PHP enum. There it is. Nope, that's interface. New PHP enum, and we're going to call this country. I like naming them singular names, even though they're going to deal with a bunch of countries. You think of it kind of like an individual case of the enum. All right, so a very simple enum we could do is something like this, case United States, like this. And I'm pretty sure that's just a valid enum. Let's actually go into PHP Artisan Tinker. I know I have a shortcut there. It's just PHP Artisan Tinker. And let's take a look at this. If we say app enums country and then specify United States, okay, we get an instance of that enum. Now here's the thing. This is just a single value. This is fine for some things in your application, but for what I'm talking about, for these select dropdowns, and more times than not, I end up using backed enums, is what they're called in PHP, where you have a value like this or a name of the enum, and then you associate it with a backing string. like some sort of key that's going to live inside your database. Now, when you do that, you do have to type the enum. So we have to say that this is a string so that we know that all the backing values are strings, because they can also be integers, but you have to type them as such so that it's enforced that every single case has that string as a backing value. So let's take a look at this now. Exit out of Tynker because we changed our code base, and let's try that again. United States. Okay, so now we have that name like we had before, but we also have a value. So we can take that data from our select dropdown and fill it in this enum, and then use that data to drive out the select dropdown. And you'll see there's even cool stuff we can do with our database to make this really clean. So let's do that. Let's open up this select dropdown and find all these. I'm going to copy them and I'm going to paste them into our country enum, and we're just going to use some multi-cursor wizardry to make this all work. So these abbreviations here, I'm just going to copy them into the clipboard. These are going to be our cases, and then let's do this. So case, and then equals string and our abbreviation, and then there's just two of these that we're going to need to put an underscore because we can't have those spaces there. Okay, so this is our new backed enum for country. Now let's remove what we have here in the options list and switch it and make it drive out of this enum here, this country enum. So we'll say for each country. Now we have to actually fully namespace this because we're inside a blade file. So app enums country, and there's a method on an enum called cases. So you can get an individual instance of the enum by typing out that name like this, or you can get all of the cases. So we'll do this, cases as country. And now we have an individual instance of each of these enumerations with both their name and their backing value. So let's try this. We have for each, and then in here we have our option, and then the value of this, we're going to have a label here and then a value. So the label is going to be, the value is going to be country name, which is a little bit backwards. I know that, but if you recall here, name is the value on the left. That's the full name here. And then value is going to be the actual labels. So this one's going to be name, and this one is going to be value. Okay, and let's see if I got that right. It's very possible that I got that wrong. I think I actually did get that wrong. It's value and then name. So I said it was backwards, but it's not. It still confuses me. I lied. I did have it wrong. What is wrong with me? Is it still wrong? It is still wrong? Okay. Well, you're in Inception with me. Let's just sanity check here. When we get the name, we should get that full name. So we do want name here. When we get the value, we should be getting that value. So I don't know why it showed up in the HTML wrong. It just did for a split second. Whatever. Okay. So this is good and pretty fine. However, the labels here, they're not great because they have these underscores. They're just our hard-coded labels inside here. Now, there are plenty of patterns to label them however you like. There's plenty of different ways to do this. I'm going to choose the simplest that you can just do in your own application. The really cool thing about enums is that you can have methods on them, like label. And now this method you can call from your enum instance. So we could do something like label here. And then inside label, this instance, that's the individual enum that we have, not the entire collection of enums. So it's a little weird. You have to get used to enums, but this we could call name and get one of these values. We could call value and get one of these keys right here. Okay, so what we want is we want to return the name, but we want to do some things with its string. Let's replace all the underscores with spaces. Okay, and then we'll type this back into a string because str in Laravel is going to return an instance of stringable, which is nice, but we want to make sure it's a clean string. So now we're echoing out label. We've done this replacement here, and let me just show you in Tynker what this looks like. If we get an individual instance like this, we can actually call label directly on it, and it's going to run that little bit of code and replace this underscore with a label. So that's great. Now we refresh and everything looks really nice, and all the values for these options are their actual abbreviation. Let's just take a look at that in the DevTools. If we pop open the DevTools, we see select, and then we see option, and there we go, value US. So when we're wire modeling this inside of our Livewire component and storing the value in the database, it's going to be these abbreviations, but the user sees these nice fields there. So that's really good. We can do a little bit more with this. There's plenty of things you can do inside label. If you want different labels that aren't just driven this way, you can do some other patterns. You could write a match function, and inside of here, you could say if if this is an instance of, and then something like country, I'm actually out of my depth here. I haven't really done this much, but something like this, and then like, oh, Canada, and then you could return, presumably. I actually don't use matches very often. Anyway, you could do something like this where you have specific labels for specific countries and then a default label that falls back to just using this label. But you decide your own implementation. You can chat GPT how to do a match statement in PHP. I just want to show you a little hack that I do to just spit out a nice, clean, friendly label. You do whatever you need to do. Okay, so now we're using this enum to drive out our select dropdown. Let's just look at that again and make sure that looks all good. That's fine. However, we can take this one step further with Livewire because Livewire actually supports enums or backed enums as properties. So right now, country is a string. We can just type hint this to country, just like this. And then import that namespace up here, app enums country. And now this property will always be an instance of an enum. And as long as you set wire model to its backing value, it's going to remain that way. And this can be an instance of that enum. You can even do things like this. You could set it to a default value like United States. And that would work in Livewire. Okay, so when we set the user, we're setting country, but it's going to yell at us. Let's actually refresh the page and see it yell at us. It's going to yell at us and say, cannot assign string to property of type enum, because a string is what we have in the database. So this is where Eloquent's casters come in handy. Let's go into our user model and take a look at these casts. Right now we're casting country to string. We can actually just cast that to this enum as well. So check this out. If we cast it to country and then we refresh, everything works because the value we're getting out of the database now, Eloquent is casting it to that enum. So let's just dump that and see what, yeah, there we go. So in the actual database, it's just storing the string, but Eloquent is taking care of all the extra stuff so that we can just get the enum out of Eloquent. We can store it as a Livewire property. It'll just support it in general, but I think it helps if you type hint this. I just like type hinting a property that is supposed to be only set to an enum. And then we go to update. Country is going to be an instance of that enum. So let me just show you that. When in our save method here, we're going to dd country. So let's change the country from United States to Argentina, and let's hit save. And there we go. Now the Livewire instance of that field is the enum, the Argentina country enum. And we just put that back into the user and we're good to go. So this makes it so that there's very little in our Livewire component that actually cares about the enum. We don't have to do a lot of extra wiring up to make sure that we have an access to this instance of an enum. We just cast it in the database. We grab it, put it in our Livewire component, and put it back into the database as an enum, and Livewire handles the rest. So to me, this is a really clean way of doing it. In a lot of my applications, I have things like a country's list of enums, a state's list for the United States, and maybe zip codes if I need those, or any big fixed data set. A lot of times, user roles like admin, or maybe a status of an invoice. It'll be pending, draft, sent, paid, things like that. Those will be enums. And this is how I set them up with select dropdowns and my Livewire components. So you don't have to do it. You can just stick with plain strings and deal with that. But in general, this is what I like to do because enums, another thing I didn't mention, enums, they make it feel a little bit better in your code base, but they're actually a little bit of implicit validation. If somebody were to set something like this, let's do option foo, and then let's put this. I actually don't know what's going to happen. I'm guessing it's just going to throw an error. We set it to foo, we hit save, and it's going to go foo is not a valid backing value for enum country. So we have our validation right there. It's just baked in. We don't have to add an extra bit of validation that says, make sure that this is in the list of countries. Although you very well could. You could totally have a rule in for all the values in that enum. But there you go. That's enums with Livewire and Eloquent. It's a pattern I really like. There you go.